welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and another deeper dive into the archive. Today I'm exploring the names of Florida's counties and where those names came from. There are 67 counties in the state, with the latest one having been created 100 years ago, while the first one sprang into existence in 1821 when the U.S. took over the territory. I'll be talking mostly about the name, not the county itself. Many of the men who were namesakes didn't have a direct connection with Florida, so in general, I wouldn't talk about them anyhow. That's part of the reason I'm exploring this subject. The names of the counties range from an obvious Florida connection to none whatsoever. The state legislature is responsible for creating counties, which means that it was ultimately a collection of male politicians who made these 67 decisions. For those unfamiliar with what a county is, each state in the U.S. is comprised of a number of subdivisions. Most states call them counties, and each has the ability to partly govern itself. Every bit of Florida is within a county, even if it's federal or state-owned land. And yes, cities are different than counties in that they're political divisions which lie within a county. While they also have specific territory, it can grow or shrink based on the desire of the residents. City residents are still subject to the laws of the county.
So starting with names that are based on natural features. These are the easiest to cover. We can start with orange and citrus counties, named after the fruit first brought to the Americas by the Spanish colonizers. These counties no longer have the large groves to produce their namesake. Citrus remains a major crop for the state. You just have to look at more southern counties. From there, we can look at Palm Beach, named for the city of Palm Beach, which got its name after a ship with thousands of coconuts ran aground nearby, and the locals ate and planted the cargo. Like citrus, coconut palms aren't native to Florida, though there's plenty of palm trees and bushes that are. The other county named for trees is a little harder to figure out. Ever wondered what Pinellas means? Well, it comes from the Spanish name for the area, Punta Pinal, or Point of Pines. Florida also has one county named for an animal. Both Manatee County and the Manatee River are named for our slow-moving aquatic herbivores. There's many counties that share river names, such as the next two. Indian River, which is about as clear a name as any, though yet again I'd like to point out that the Indian River is a lagoon. Arguably, the county could be renamed Indigenous Lagoon County. The other river county is Holmes, named for Holmes Creek, though sadly it's not certain who Holmes was. There's a lot of guesses, however. Leaving rivers behind for the moment, we move on to Lake County. The name is attributed to the large number of lakes in the county, but with around 30,000 lakes scattered throughout the state, many counties could use that rather generic title. The other water county I'll mention now is Gulf, named for the Gulf of Mexico it borders. It's not surprising that so many counties have watery names, yet only one is connected to the land, the rather conspicuously named Highlands County. It contains the southern part of the Lake Wales Ridge, which makes it one of the highest counties with a 210-foot average elevation, double the entire state average. By the way, Lake County is at the northern end of the Lake Wales Ridge and has an average elevation of 184 feet. And it contains the highest point in the peninsula, Sugarloaf Mountain, at 312 feet above sea level. The final county in this section is Glades. It borders the southern part of Highlands County and is named for the Everglades. Also bordering Lake Okeechobee, the county is home to the northern reaches of the Everglades. Our next section is one of Catholic saints. It's not surprising, considering how long Florida was a Spanish territory, that we have a few of these, but the Spanish didn't have counties. There's 4, each associated with water. The first is one of the 2 original counties, St. John's. It originally was East Florida and is named for the St. John's River. Its name stems from an early Spanish mission established around 1590. Named San Juan del Puerto, or St. John of the Harbor, it's unclear as to which particular St. John it honored. The next is St. Andrew the Apostle, the namesake for St. Andrew's Bay in Bay County. Andrew is considered to be one of the 12 apostles chosen by Jesus. Nearby is Santa Rosa, named for the long barrier island, in turn named for St. Rosa Viterbo, who was a 13th century Italian teen who died around the age of 18. Another female saint rounds out Florida's sanctified counties, that of St. Lucy. St. Lucy is unique in that it has been used as a name of 2 different counties, as it was the original name of Brevard County. Born in the 3rd century, St. Lucy was from Sicily. She's the patron saint of martyrs and the blind, hence the weird platter holding eyes in her portraits. The name was first given to a 16th century Spanish fort near Cape Canaveral. Moving on, I'll look at the county names that are, or are believed to be, derived from indigenous languages. Now, if you look at this image of Florida, it shows the approximate historic ranges of their communities. Prior to the arrival of Europeans, Florida had a good-sized population, especially along the coastlines and major rivers. Estimates range from 100,000 to 350,000 people, who were divided into various groups. The groups also represent a number of different languages, many of which we know very little, and none had developed writing. Our first county name is Miami-Dade. Since this is a compound name, I'll cover the second part a little later, but the Miami part comes from the name of a group who lived at the southern end of Lake Okeechobee. Their name, Miami, is supposed to mean big water, referring to the massive lake. The name may not have been what the group called itself, but it gave its name to the Miami River and the city. We might as well stick with Okeechobee now, since that word from the Hitchiti language also means big water, and is today the name of the county at the north end of Florida's largest lake. Note that Hitchiti was a tribal town in southern Georgia that used a dialect of the Muskegon language, and speakers of Hitchiti ended up being part of the Trail of Tears that forcibly marched some 70,000 people from the south to what became Oklahoma. Some of the people escaped to Florida, including some that spoke Muskegon, Miccosukee, Creek, and Hitchiti. They were driven by the U.S. Army and Florida militia all the way to the Everglades, which is how a number of place names in that area stem from a language originally located hundreds of miles away. The obvious name to discuss next is Seminole. Its namesake is another group connected with the Muskegee and Miccosukee. In fact, Seminole is a language that's also within the Muskegon language family. We can now jump to the northern part of the state to look at Escambia. Along with St. John's, it was the other first county. Yet again, it's connected with more water features, the Escambia River and Bay. The origin of the name is unclear and may come from either creek, clear water, or Choctaw, reed break. Then again, it could have somehow derived from Spanish. To the east is Okaloosa, a Choctaw term for black water. Today, one of the county's many small rivers is the Blackwater, which runs into Santa Rosa County, where Blackwater River State Park is. Once again heading east, we visit Wakulla County, Springs and River. It's thought to be a Timucua term, though the meaning has been lost. Some locals like to say that Wakulla means mystery, though there's no factual basis for that. Meanwhile, its actual meaning is a mystery. On to Alachua. Its name likely comes from the Creek language, yet again part of the Muskegon family. Drop the A off the front of the name and you get a word meaning jug. Or, some people think it was a Timucua word, who were the earlier inhabitants of the area. That word is supposed to have meant sinkhole. Now, the predominant feature in the area is Payne's Prairie, which is a huge freshwater prairie and marsh. The Alachua Sink is a large sinkhole in the bottom of Payne's Prairie. It's generally covered by water and not visible, though occasionally sediments plugging the bottom of the sinkhole will unclog and flush most of the prairie marsh water into the Florida aquifer, so the creek term for jug certainly could apply. At this point, I've got 4 more names that are possibly from indigenous languages. There's Volusia, named for a landing on the St. Johns River near Lake George. Now, there's no consensus as to its origin. It could be an indigenous word, named either for a British or French settler, or, and I kid you not, an author from 2nd century Rome. Suwannee, that most famous of Florida places, fares little better. Possibly it's Cherokee for Echo River, or a corruption of the Spanish San Juan. That was the name of a mission nearby. Sarasota joins these two. We know the area had that name by the mid-1700s, but there's no evidence as to its origin. Possibly an indigenous name, or not. Finally, we can look at Charlotte. Now, Charlotte's a European name, but that's not its origin. It's believed it started out as the word Calusa, the powerful indigenous group that once called Southwest Florida home. It's thought that the Spanish modified the word into Carlos, as that's what the Spanish called the Calusa leader. When the British took possession of Florida, they changed it to honor Queen Charlotte. The next category is, I'm afraid, just titled Other. Liberty opens the category. While it has an admirable name, it's ironically the least populous county in the state, and it's the only dry county, with all the sales of alcohol prohibited. Next is Dixie, which has a name that's now regrettable. It's the only Dixie county in the U.S. On the other hand, Union is one of 17 with that name. Florida's has a confusing name for some who don't know its story, which you can learn about in this video. By the way, Louisiana has a Union parish. Some of the Union counties are named because they were created out of parts of 2 or more counties. Florida's is actually the opposite. It was created out of just 1 county, and the name refers to the inhabitants of the new county who were united in their wish to be separate from Bradford County. Still in the other category is Nassau and Hillsborough. Nassau comes from the former Duchy of Nassau that's today part of Germany. It's a German word for floodplain. The name first appears during the British control of Florida. At least the definition floodplain is apt. Hillsborough's namesake also predates U.S. Florida. It was named for Wills Hill, an 18th century British noble and politician. And yes, that's his real name. He had a number of royal titles, including the Earl of Hillsborough. Hill served as Secretary of State for the colonies for 4 years prior to the American Revolution. He was also granted a large portion of land in British Florida, near what would become Hillsborough Bay. But he never visited Florida himself. Hillsborough is the first county in this video that's named for a man. And that's going to be a theme for all the rest. We can start with the counties named for Spanish explorers. Columbia is named for Christopher Columbus, and yes, he was from Genoa in Italy, but was still a Spanish explorer. In his 4 trips to the New World, he never reached Florida, making him already the second man so far with this distinction. Juan Ponce de Leon is the namesake of Leon County. De Leon's expedition was the first official expedition to land in Florida, including giving it its name in 1513. The next 2 counties share a unique distinction in the state. They're named for the same man, Hernando and de Soto. In 1839, he landed south of Tampa Bay with an expedition force of 600 men. The expedition traveled north, a trip that included the first large-scale killing of indigenous people in Florida by Europeans. An additional legacy of all 3 of Florida's Spanish explorer namesakes is that they took part in enslaving thousands of humans. From Spanish, we move on to Americans. There are 7 counties named for presidents and 1 for a vice president. These are in chronological order: Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, Polk, and Taylor. Calhoun was named for John C. Calhoun, the 7th vice president, and one of only 2 to serve with 2 different presidents. As you can see while I run through the images, the list includes 5 of the first 7 presidents and ends with the 12th. The presidents and VP were all Southerners and were all slaveholders. On the other hand, the only one who ever visited Florida was Andrew Jackson. As General Jackson, he led his forces in an invasion of Spanish Florida during the First Seminole War to end resistance by Seminole, Spanish, and escaped slaves. While the U.S. returned the seized territory to Spain, it was a main reason why Spain sold Florida in 1819. Once the U.S. officially took over Florida, Jackson became its territorial governor. Since each of the presidents served before the Civil War, I'll start with other men of that era. It includes founding fathers such as Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton. We can also put Gilbert de Motier on that list, though you'll probably know him better as the Marquis de Lafayette, a general that helped fight the Revolutionary War. He's the namesake of Lafayette County, a semi-dry county, allowing only beer sales, which, yet again, is ironic considering that it's named for a Frenchman who likely preferred wine to beer. Franklin and Hamilton are named for men who did what they could to create and define the U.S. Now, it may come as a surprise, but both Lafayette and Franklin were slaveholders at one point, though both became active abolitionists. Lafayette's slave history is complex. At the same time he argued against slavery, he owned 3 plantations in French Guiana and never freed the slaves. Hamilton's connection with slavery is less clear. While he certainly argued against it, experts think it's likely that he owned a couple slaves for domestic work. Of the 3, Lafayette was the only one who had a Florida connection. Like Wills Hill, he was given a land grant here as thanks for his efforts during the Revolution. Now let me say parenthetically that I know I'm talking a lot about slavery. My goal isn't to make it the primary point of this video, but obviously it stands out. Likewise, many of those counties, beyond those named after men, share a name with a body of water, be it a gulf, bay, harbor, river, lagoon, or lake. That's significant, and so is the fact that all the men are men, and with the exception of one man, are all European. I'll offer more observations at the appropriate time, but I thought it'd be good to say this now. So there's a few more men who lack a Florida connection. That'd be General Thomas Sumter and General Francis Marion. Marion is better known as the Swamp Fox. He got that name commanding irregular troops during the Revolutionary War, which raided British forces using guerrilla-style attacks. Born in South Carolina, his command was also centered there. That appears to be important to his name being lent to a Central Florida county. Apparently, there were quite a few Carolinians in the county when it was formed. While Sumter was a native Virginian, he also served in South Carolina. Sumter's tactics and the ferocity of his command caused British General Charles Cornwallis to comment that Sumter fought like a gamecock. So that theater of war produced a swamp fox and a Carolina gamecock. Sumter's activities were so impressive that 125 years later, the University of South Carolina chose the gamecock as their mascot. And yes, both generals owned plantations and were slaveholders. Another without a connection to Florida was Henry Clay, who served Kentucky as a U.S. representative and senator, and who'd be chosen by President John Quincy Adams as his Secretary of State. Clay was one of the few leaders to denounce Andrew Jackson's invasion of Florida, which hurt him politically. Later, Clay opposed slavery, calling it a grievous wrong to the slave. But he never freed his own slaves and was publicly adamant that there was no reason to do so. From this point on, each of the men either lived in Florida or had significant ties to the state. While Jackson was the first territorial governor, he was also an army general, as Florida was under military control at first. William Pope Duval succeeded Jackson as Florida's first civilian governor in 1822. He served for 12 years, with the most notable event being that Tallahassee was developed as the capital on the site of an indigenous village. George Walton Jr. served as the Secretary of the Territory under Duval for the first 5 years of the territory. It was during this time, in 1824, that Walton County was founded. 2 years later, in 1826, Walton resigned as secretary, but it had come to light that he'd collected nearly $10,000 in taxes in Key West, but didn't turn it over to the Treasury. That's the equivalent of $320,000 in 2025. In an 1828 trial, the jury found him liable, yet Walton claimed to have no money, and it fell upon his mother to resolve the issue. She turned over property which was auctioned off. There were a number of other issues in his life, including being wounded in a duel. He wore out his welcome in Florida and moved to Mobile. Both he and Duval were slaveholders. Major Francis Dade, the other namesake of Miami-Dade County, was from Virginia and part of Jackson's illegal invasion of Florida. He remained in the military, including commanding Army forces in Key West. In 1835, Dade was transferred to Fort Brooke, near present-day Tampa. While taking men and armaments from Fort Brooke to Fort King that December, Indigenous forces led by Chiefs Micanopy and Chipko ambushed the column of 110 men, killing all but 2, starting the Second Seminole War. Putnam was also named for an officer involved in the Seminole Wars. Benjamin Alexander Putnam was born in Georgia, and after the Dade ambush, he was asked to command a Florida militia company formed in Mosquito County, known as the Mosquito Roarers. The other county named for a Seminole War veteran is Osceola, which, oddly enough, takes its name from a leader of the opposing side. Named Billy Powell at birth, Osceola's father was a Scottish trader, William Powell, while Polly Coppinger, his mother, was part Muskogee and European. He and his mother moved to Florida and joined up with Seminoles. He was given the name Osceola, which loosely means black drink singer, referring to strong tea made from the Yaupon holly. Osceola took part in an attack on Fort King that occurred simultaneously with the Dade ambush. In 1837, he was captured with other Seminoles while meeting in St. Augustine under a white flag of truce. He remained in custody until the next year, when he died from an untreated abscess. While both Dade and Putnam were slaveholders, there's no evidence that Osceola was. Next, we look at Brevard, Gadsden, and Levy. Theodorus Washington Brevard served as Florida's comptroller through the 1850s. His role was that of the chief fiscal officer. He was born in North Carolina, settled in Tallahassee, and worked as a lawyer and judge. In 1855, while serving as comptroller, Brevard County was created. Gadsden County was named after James Gadsden, who is a footnote in most school history books. It was he who negotiated the final significant acquisition of land in the contiguous U.S. Purchased for $10 million from Mexico, it was known as the Gadsden Purchase. He served in the Army under Jackson and established two forts, Brooke and Gadsden, both illegally located in Spanish Florida. Levy County shares a namesake with the town of Yulee in Nassau County, named for David Levy Yulee, a native of the Virgin Islands and born to Jewish parents. He was part of Florida's Constitutional Convention and became Florida's first U.S. Senator. He owned a vast sugar plantation near Homosassa, which would be destroyed by Union troops during the Civil War, and afterwards he was imprisoned after being accused of aiding the escape of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Prior to that war, he was one of the largest slaveholders in the state. Brevard and Gadsden also owned slaves. Since David Levy brings us into the Civil War, the next counties are named for men who chose the Confederate side on which to fight. The first, Bradford, pays homage to a man with a similar tragic story to Major Dade. Captain Richard Bradford was the first Florida officer to be killed in the war. It happened during the small battle of Santa Rosa Island in October 1861. He was one of about 50 soldiers on both sides that died. He was 25 and had just begun practicing law. Little more is known about him, including whether or not he was a native. It's unlikely that he owned slaves. Hendry, another captain, fared better in the Civil War. Francis Asbury Hendry was born in Georgia and also served in the Third Seminole War. Between the wars, he was a successful cattle rancher and owned a number of slaves. He was part of Florida's cow cavalry, basically a home guard made up of men and boys who guarded the supply of cattle, Florida's primary contribution to the Confederacy. After the war, Hendry worked to make our next county a reality, encouraging the legislature to name it for a man he greatly admired, Robert E. Lee. Lee County's namesake needs no introduction, as he was head of the Confederate Army, though his pre-Civil War military career brought him to Florida. As a captain in the Army Engineer Corps, he'd command a survey crew and updated maps of Florida. Later, through his wife, he inherited the large plantation at Arlington. His father-in-law's will stated that the enslaved people on the plantation should be freed within 5 years. Many of the slaves thought emancipation wasn't happening and nearly revolted. It was only by selling off many slaves that Lee restored order. That brings me to Pascoe and Baker. Samuel Pascoe was born in London, England. He moved to Florida and worked as a school principal. He joined the 3rd Florida Infantry at the outbreak of war, but was captured within a year. He spent 5 years in prison, only getting out once the Confederacy lost. Back in Florida, he was a lawyer and U.S. Senator, and as far as I know, he didn't own slaves. While Pascoe began his political career after the war, James Baker was elected judge in 1859. 2 years later, the legislature created Baker County and chose him to be one of Florida's senators in the Confederate Congress. He, like Hendry and Lee, owned slaves. Now, my last category is men in post-war Florida. 4 are Florida governors: Broward, Gilchrist, Hardee, and Martin. Broward shows that France isn't the only place that can put a Napoleon Bonaparte in charge. Broward's dad named him to honor the French emperor. He'd started as a river pilot and sheriff, but his biggest legacy was his work to drain the Everglades and turn the area into farmland. Gilchrist was the final county to be created, and Albert Waller Gilchrist succeeded Broward in office. He was a civil engineer, and his name was chosen when he was on his deathbed. In an impromptu vote, the legislature substituted his name. Without the change, we'd have a melon county for the watermelons that grow there. As you can see, Florida had a habit of naming counties for men who were still alive. Indeed, Cary Augustus Hardy was in his first year as governor when Hardy County was created. He had served in a number of other political roles before then, but it suggested that it was done to curry favor. Other names were Cherokee, Waukulla, and even Seminole, until it was pointed out that the state already had a Seminole County. In a case of déjà vu, Martin is named for a governor who was also in his first year. Unfortunately, John Martin's time in office was rough. The state suffered the collapse of the Florida land boom and 2 devastating hurricanes, massive storms resulting in around 3,000 deaths. Now, while Governor Gilchrist was born in South Carolina, the other 3 were the only Floridian natives. Our final 2 counties are Collier and Flagler, named for a baron and a robber baron. Flagler County is named for Henry Morrison Flagler. First arriving in Florida for the health of his wife, by 1885 he was investing heavily in the state, creating fantastic resorts for the wealthy, as well as buying a number of local railroads to create a unified one with better rail lines and rolling stock. To achieve this, he used what was known as convict leasing, a system where businesses pay the state for labor, then prisoners were forced to work without pay. Collier County's Baron G. Collier was another significant investor of the state, particularly in the Southwest. The Tennessee native owned 1.3 million acres in Florida, nearly the size of the county which bears his name. Like Broward, he pushed to drain the Everglades. Plus, he supported the building of the Tamiami Trail. And when the highway project ran out of money, Collier promised to complete it if the state would create a new county and name it Collier. Quite possibly, that's the most remarkable way a Florida county was ever named. Now let me give some perspective concerning the names of these 67 counties. There's 12 that are specifically named for natural things. I've included Bay County, even though it's in the religious category, but if they wanted to name it St. Andrew, they would have. Now this begs the question about those which share a name with a natural feature. Were the namers simply referring to the feature, or did they have a specific connection to its name? That's not something that was recorded, so it's not clear. That being said, I'd guess that most of the time it's about the natural feature. So I'll add the other 3 saintly counties. On top of that, I'd add the indigenous names that refer to natural features. I'll add Nassau, a place name, and then Dixie, Liberty, and Union. This brings us to 28. And these are the water counties, with names that are also water features. That gives an idea of just how important water is as a natural feature in the state.
As for those named for people, I want to look at their shared characteristics. Firstly, there is Seminole and Charlotte counties, the only ones named for groups of people. While Charlotte was renamed by the British, it was originally named for the Calusa, so Seminole and Charlotte aren't specifically named for a single person. That leaves 37 counties with only 3 of them named for Florida natives. That's not surprising, as U.S. possession of Florida began in 1821. There's 13 counties named for men who had no connection with Florida at all. Hillsborough and Lafayette were men who owned property here but never visited. And while Ponce de Leon is credited with discovering Florida, he made only a brief landing to claim the land for Spain. There's 7 counties named for Florida governors, 7 for presidents, and 2 for just vice presidents, including Thomas Jefferson. All the men were white Europeans except for Osceola and Levy, though Osceola is believed to have been at least half European. Levi, who is the only Jewish person to be a namesake, likely was part European and partly Middle Eastern. The final thing to look at is of the 27 men who were adults prior to the Civil War, 22 are confirmed slaveholders. And yes, it's not surprising. Nearly every man was a Southerner, slavery was legal, and there were certainly substantial economic benefits to owning slaves. Most men at the time who could afford to owned slaves. So that's a look at the 67 county names in Florida. It's an overview, but it helped me identify some interesting stories to look into for future videos. If anything here piqued your interest, leave a comment to let me know. Thank you for watching another of my videos. I hope you enjoyed it. If you learned something, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more on Florida's tourism history. And please check out my Patreon account. I'd really appreciate it. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.